research, including the grant and NCOS and Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and as well as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Okay, next slide. So as many of you may know, beaches and dunes are very common on our shoreline. We have about 45% of the Oregon and Washington coastline that's made up of beaches and dunes, so sandy beach habitats. The largest dune sheet actually in North America occurs in Oregon, down in Southern Oregon. Next slide. And prior to 1900, Pacific coast dunes were very sparsely vegetated. They had a lot of native vegetation, and there was mostly a kind of open, shifting sand environment with lots of really interesting native plant species as well as native animals. But that shifting sand environment meant that it created a lot of instability along the areas that people wanted to develop, and especially, you know, across roads and towns and so forth. So in the early 1900s, Risa, you can move to the next slide. In the early 1900s, two species of non-native beachgrasses were systematically planted along the coast, the entire Pacific coast. And what that led to was a stabilization of these habitats and really creating what we call foredunes, which are these large hills of sand that are immediately behind a typical beach. And so we have mostly vegetated foredunes along all of our dunes at this point. These invasive grasses were really good at stabilizing sand and growing, and essentially have usurped all of that habitat. Next slide. And the way this happened was through a kind of a biophysical feedback between the vegetation, which captures sand, and then the sand itself being captured. And so there's sort of this positive feedback that happens. The more sand that's captured, the better the grasses grow. And so then the better the grasses grow, the more sand that's captured. And so essentially it leads to these, you know, foredunes, which are, you know, can range from, you know, 3 meters tall to 18 meters tall along the coast. Next slide. And that's, you know, this foredune, these foredunes have really kind of created this landscape level transformation of the coast. You can see a picture here on the left of Pacific City, Oregon in 1930, prior to the beachgrass introductions, and then a photo below in 2012 where you can see, you know, lots of green, lots of foredunes, and then also a lot of development behind those foredunes. The photo on the right is a picture of Umpqua dunes, which is that very large dune sheet that I mentioned earlier. And you can see the foredune right, you know, next to the beach, and then behind that foredune, there's this entire habitat that's been created called the deflation plain, which is a sort of a wetland area that has coastal scrub and also can be forested. So quite a big change in terms of the amount of vegetation that is on our dunes now. Next slide. And so, you know, there's been, with that introduction, there's been shifting ecosystem services. So we know that foredunes can provide a lot of coastal resilience in terms of, you know, capturing beach sand, serving as barriers for extreme storm events or sea level rise or tsunamis. They can also prevent beach erosion compared to, for example, gray infrastructure, so seawalls or riprap or those sorts of engineered structures. And then we're working on this as well, but looking, also realizing that these foredunes can sequester carbon, so they can store carbon compared to, you know, the sort of systems that we had prior to 1900. So a lot more carbon is being stored in these systems given the amount of grass that's present. You know, there are also some dune conservation and aesthetic concerns with foredunes and beach grasses in particular. For example, there's been decline of all those nice native species that I showed earlier, and including some animal species, including the western snowy plover. There's been increases in invasion of other plant species, for example, Scotch broom and gorse. And then there's concern that these foredunes can interfere with coastal view sheds and aesthetic values that we place on those view sheds. Next slide. And actually, it turns out that 2 different species of beach grasses were introduced in the early 1900s. The first one was the European beach grass. So this species was brought from Europe, in particular, I think from France, the coasts of France. And this is Ammophila arenaria, European beach grass. It was the first species to be introduced in the early 1900s, and it spread across the entire coast. By the 1950s, it was pretty much everywhere on the coast, from Mexico up to Canada. And then a second species, the American beach grass, which is native to the East Coast and also the Great Lakes, was introduced in the 1930s, and it was introduced near the Columbia River, and it spread mostly north, and actually dominated, and in many cases has outcompeted the European beach grass in these areas. And so these 2 species co-occur. They have a co-occurrence, which you can see on this map here, where we have Ammophila breviligulata, which is the American beach grass species from kind of northern Oregon up into Washington, and then Ammophila arenaria, which is, occurs pretty much over the entire coastline. But there is this region where they co-occur. Next slide. And it turns out that even though they look really similar, you might not think that they were very different. They actually have a different way of capturing sand that means that they sort of create different dune shapes. So the research that we've done over the last 15 years has shown that the European beach grass is really good at growing tall and narrow dunes compared to the American beach grass, which is much better at growing laterally and creating kind of shorter, wider dunes. And so we've done a lot of research on this. We've done experiments and also field surveys and observations. And what our work shows is that due to this interaction between sand supply and this species-specific growth form, so how they actually grow in the field, you can have different shape. The result can be different shaped dunes. Next slide. Another unintended result is this hybridization. So these 2 species obviously were planted at different times, but they interact, they co-occur in certain regions of the coast, in particular from northern Oregon up into southern Washington. And in these areas where they co-occur, they actually are hybridizing. And so in 2012, so 10 years ago, we found this very unusual beach grass on Long Beach, Washington. And you can see a picture here of the American beach grass on the left, Ammophila arenaria, which is near the top of the dune in the middle, and then this hybrid beach grass, which is on the right. And you can see kind of this huge lump of grass, and that is actually the hybrid. And so what we wanted to know was it a hybrid? We couldn't tell from just looking at it in the field. So we conducted a bunch of measurements and genetic analyses to try to discern whether or not it actually is a hybrid between these 2 parent species. Next slide. And so one of the things that we realized right away, and actually kind of was the impetus behind thinking that it was a hybrid beach grass, was looking at this structure on the grass called a ligule. And the ligule is just this little tissue that's kind of, Rebecca likes to say, at the elbow of the grass. So at the juncture between where the blade meets the stem of the grass, and there's a little tissue there, and it's called the ligule. And Ammophila arenaria has a ligule that's on average about 24 millimeters long. Ammophila breviligulata, so breviligule, so tiny little ligule, has a ligule that's about 2 millimeters on average. And it turned out that the hybrid beach grass had an intermediate size ligule, and it's about 8 millimeters. After we did all of our measurements, we determined that it was an intermediate sized ligule. We also measured the width of the leaves. We measured the height of the plant, so their shoot height. And we also measured the number of shoots per plant. And we actually measured a whole bunch of things that I don't have here. But what you can see here is that compared to its parent species, the hybrid has kind of intermediate width leaves and also intermediate numbers of shoots per plant, but it's actually taller than its two parent species. So that it has some characteristics that are sort of intermediate in morphology and some that are actually kind of what you might think of as hybrid vigor, like they're actually kind of beefed up compared to the two parent species. Next slide. And we also, as I mentioned, did some genetic work. So this is work that Rebecca did. She sequenced the 3 grass species, so the Ammophila arenaria, Ammophila breviligulata, and the hybrid. And she looked at whether or not the hybrid actually shared chromosomes from both species. And that graph there on the left shows that, yes, indeed, they do share chromosomes from both. The hybrid does share chromosomes from both species, and that it is, in fact, a hybrid, a true hybrid of the two parent species. Next slide. And then one of the things that we really wanted to know was what would happen if you planted the hybrid in a common garden situation. So you took the hybrid and the two parent species and you planted them in a common environment, see what would happen in terms of their growth. So who grows faster than and who grows slower, and then also in terms of their interactions with each other. So do they compete with each other? Do they help each other? Do they facilitate each other? We wanted to know kind of what was the interactions, what kind of interactions we might expect to see in the field by using this common garden experiment. And so this is work that Rebecca did. Again, she's over there in the background planting plants. And what she did was she planted the beach grass, so Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata, and the hybrid, all in monoculture, so all by themselves in each one of these bags. And then she also pairwise planted Ammophila arenaria with the hybrid, or Ammophila breviligulata with the hybrid, to look at the interactions between all 3 species. And so she planted them. This is at Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon, where we conducted the experiment. Filled all these bags with sand, and then added the beach grasses, and then added sand over time to stimulate growth of the grasses themselves. And you can see the resulting pictures of the beach grasses, and you can really see the below ground biomass, which is pretty extensive in these bags once we washed off the sand after 15 months of growth. Next slide. And this is just a graph of what happened in terms of the growth rate differences between the three species. And you can see that Ammophila arenaria is in red, Ammophila breviligulata is in blue, and then the hybrid is the purple graph. And right away, you can see that over a 15-month period, when these three species were grown on their own, the hybrid doubled the growth rate of the two parent species. So the hybrid had the highest growth rate by far of the three taxa, which was kind of surprising to us. We expected that it might grow better, but we were really shocked to see how much better it grew compared to its parent species in this common garden situation. Next slide. And then we also looked at the competition between the species, and this graph just shows the competitive effects of one species on another. And the competitive effects are negative, but one of the things that you can see is that the hybrid was actually the competitive dominant over both of the species. And we would expect this because obviously the hybrid has greater biomass and is growing at a greater rate. And so that's actually translating into its ability to outcompete its parent species. So it's a competitive dominant over both species, but particularly the American beachgrass species. So Ammophila breviligulata, the one that is dominant up in the northern range of where all these species co-occur. Okay, so next slide. So Risa's going to take over and tell us about the work that she's doing now going forward, now that we know that what we know about the hybrid that I've just explained. And then she's also going to talk about the citizen science program. So take it away, Risa.
Awesome. Thanks, Sally, for that introduction to the natural history of the dunes and the common garden experiment. So as Sally mentioned, now that we have a better idea of the hybrid's competitive effects and also its growth rate over time compared to its parents, we still have these remaining questions about where it is on the dunes and what it means for dune functions and services. So the first question I'll talk about that's part of my master's work is about the range, limit, and abundance of the hybrid beachgrass, or how much is out there and where is it? To answer this first question, I worked with these two students last summer, and that was Rose Antaki, shown here on the left, a field tech who's worked in our lab for many years, and then also Hugh Lee, an undergrad researcher who graduates this week. And as you can see, we're all super enthusiastic about beachgrass. And last summer, we walked all up and down the dunes within the hybrid's range. We documented new hybrid patches, measured its growth form, and other hybrid patch characteristics. So not as glamorous or exciting as being chased by sandworms like in Dune, but it was still a pretty fun job. Before I talk about what we found when we looked for the hybrid and the hybrid's abundance, I first want to talk about the different ways that we looked for the hybrid beachgrass, because I think to most people, including me at first, it just looks like a clump of grass surrounded by other clumps of grass. They all look the same at first, but once you know what to look for, you get this search image in your head and the hybrid beachgrass can jump out at you even from really far away. So the first thing that we looked for were flowers at a time when only the hybrid was in peak flowering. On the left here is a graph from Rebecca, who's done a bunch of work looking at the hybrid's flowering time or phenology compared to its parent species. And what she found when she measured flowers over time is that Ammophila arenaria flowers first in late June and early July. The hybrid flowers next in July, like the whole month of July. And then Ammophila breviligulata flowers last in August and September. So the best time to look for the hybrid is right in July, when Ammophila arenaria flowers are visibly older and Ammophila breviligulata flowers haven't emerged yet. The second thing we learned to look for on the dunes for the hybrid was these bumps or tall, dense patches of grass, which often turned out to be the hybrid, although it wasn't always foolproof. Sometimes Ammophila arenaria tricked us. But when combining it with our knowledge of the beachgrass's flowering time and being able to pick it out from far away, this could also be incredibly useful for finding the hybrid. So now that we know what to look for, I'll move on to the broader picture of what Rose, Hugh, and I found when we looked for the hybrid last summer, which was a ton of hybrid beachgrass in nearly every spot that we looked within its range. Before we did our field season last summer, there were 27 known hybrid patches. And after our summer field season, we quadrupled this number. And now there's currently 117 patches that have been discovered by us, as well as other researchers and community scientists. We know that we found the hybrid from Pacific City, Oregon in the south, all the way up to Ocean Shores, Washington in the north. We found the most patches in Ocean Shores and Long Beach, Washington, in those two areas, although there's likely much more. So the amount that we're showing here is just probably a small portion of what is actually out there, because there's only so much we can detect by walking the dunes. If this doesn't look like a lot on the map, it's because a lot of the points are on top of each other, and the hybrid is really dense in certain specific areas that we looked. So for instance, if we just zoom into this one area in Long Beach that was walked by Sally and Rebecca on a dune field trip, there are 26 patches that they found in just over a mile. And this is about a hybrid patch every 100 steps or 0.05 miles. So it's just everywhere here. And the empty areas to the north and south of this cluster of hybrid patches don't reflect an absence of hybrid. They're just areas where we didn't have time to search. So there's likely more just around this area. And now I want to zoom in a little bit further, not just to the location of the hybrid patches in terms of their latitude, but also its location on the dune profile, which is shown here. At its most basic, a dune profile has certain areas, the toe closest to the beach, the face as it slopes upward, the crest at the highest point, and the heel or the dip in the back area. When we documented where we found the hybrid patches, what we noticed is that the hybrid was most abundant at the toe, face, and crest areas, at least what we currently found. We didn't often find hybrid patches at the heel. This could be for a variety of different reasons. So one of them is the fact that it's just really hard to search in the heel area or the dense older vegetation away from the beach. It's harder to trudge through. But another reason is also because the hybrid's parents flower more in areas closer to the beach. So with increased flowers, potentially there's more opportunities for hybridization events. So we're not sure why, or the reasons why we find more hybrid there, but we know we do. Another important thing to note is that this area is also where the most sand deposition occurs. It's the point at which dunes are formed most recently and where beach grasses and vegetation have the most influence on the dune shape. And that'll be important for reasons when I talk about the hybrid's effect on dune ecosystem services. So in this more zoomed in picture of where we find the hybrid patches, we also see some strong patterns in what parent species co-occur at each site. All the patches that we found, except this one patch at Pacific City in Oregon, occur where Ammophila breviligulata is dominant, and then there's just these sparse scattered patches of Ammophila arenaria. So a lot of what we see in the field looks like this picture, although it's hard to pick out. There's this hybrid patch in the background, and it's surrounded by this whole sea or this dune of Ammophila breviligulata. And then off to the side, we find this patch of Ammophila arenaria. And so there's these strong patterns of species co-occurrence as well. The last thing I want to note about the hybrid patches is that there's a wide variety in the size of patches that we see. So on the smaller end, there's this patch in Ocean Shores, Washington. It's just a few square meters and it has really dense clumped stems, including hybrid flowers. You can see how the hybrid flowers here are taller than those around them too. And then the patches range in size and density all the way up to this really large patch we found at Pacific City, which is nearly a square kilometer. You may be able to see the flags peppering the dune, and those are all hybrid stems. So this is a much more sparse patch compared to the small, dense patches that we find. So a wide variety, but patch is still a useful metric in starting to understand how much is out there and where it is. Now that we are starting to have a better picture of where the hybrid is by latitude, dune profile, and in relation to its parent species, we're also starting to investigate how it could influence several important dune functions and services, such as coastal protection, or dune shape, coastal protection, carbon sequestration, and species diversity. And I'll touch on each of these functions and services, starting with how the hybrid could influence dune shape. One of the characteristics of the hybrid we looked at in the field were those important for sand capture and dune building, or stem density and height. So first we looked at beachgrass stem density of the hybrid compared to its parents, and we found that the hybrid grows at these really high stem densities, similar to Ammophila arenaria and denser than Ammophila breviligulata. When we looked at beachgrass height as well, we find that the hybrid grows taller than both of its parents by about 10 centimeters in the field, similar to what was found early on in the hybrid's discovery too. So we continue to see that the hybrid grows taller than its parents, both of its parents, and denser than one of its parents. As Sally mentioned earlier in the talk too, how vegetation grows is really important for the amount of sand that it'll capture and the shape of dunes that it'll produce. The dunes are formed through this two-way biophysical feedback between sand supply and vegetation growth. So as a small plant continues to grow and sand is deposited, these small hummocks on the dunes over time become dunes, some of which can be really gigantic. I don't know if you can spot me and another person on this 30-foot tall dune. And these dunes are dictated by sand supply and, again, vegetation species, even if it's hard to imagine them this small. So using this information, as well as what we know about the Ammophila beachgrass traits, we can start to predict the shape of dunes that the hybrid could form. We know from Sally's section that Ammophila arenaria produces these taller, narrower dunes. Ammophila breviligulata has these shorter, wider dunes. And then we just talked about two of the hybrid's exceptional dune building traits compared to its parents. And we've also observed from Rebecca's bag experiment earlier that the hybrid has high lateral and high vertical growth. And so our hypothesis is that the hybrid could potentially produce dunes that are as tall or taller than Ammophila arenaria and as wide as Ammophila breviligulata. And this is important because we mentioned the hybrid occurs in areas that are mainly dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. And so the hybrid could potentially increase dune height in these areas, potentially protecting against flooding and erosion from storms and sea level rise better than Ammophila breviligulata. So that's our hypothesis about the shape of dunes the hybrid will form. And now we want to actually test that to see if it's true in field conditions, which are much more variable. And we're testing this in two different ways. One of them is through these surveys using GPS transects that are run through the hybrid patch with this GPS Trimble backpack. And this equipment gives us elevation over a distance. So eventually it gives us graphs that look like this. And we can pick out points that are within versus outside of the hybrid patches. And from these data, we can start to investigate if areas within the hybrid patch have greater elevation or capture more sand than areas outside of the hybrid patch. So that's one way we're looking at the hybrid's influence on sand accretion and dune shape. Another is through this large-scale common garden experiment done at Nehalem Bay, Oregon, which is a collaboration with many, many people. Dr. Megan Wengrove, shown in the front of this left photo here, is the lead investigator, and Sally and Peter Ruggiero, also at Oregon State University, are the co-investigators. Some of the experiment's main objectives are to assess the role of different vegetation, different species, including the hybrid, in forming dunes. So in February 2021, we initiated this experiment led by Megan, and nearly 7,000 grasses were planted with over 50 volunteers. Because it was February on the Oregon coast, the conditions were pretty brutal in hail and brutal wind. But we established 8 experimental plots. 2 are bare and the rest are planted with vegetation. And these vegetated plots include both mixes and monocultures and native and non-native species. Oh, excuse me, 9 experimental plots with 2 being bare. And I'll briefly go through the vegetated plots and talk about each of the species in them. First, there are the hybrid's parents, so Ammophila arenaria, Ammophila breviligulata, and a mixture of the 2. Then there's the hybrid beachgrass. And then finally, we have our native dune grass, Elamis mollis, a mixture of native and non-native dune grasses. And then finally, a native mixture of native plants and native grasses and native forbs. All of these plots, vegetated and bare, are being monitored for vegetation growth through ecological surveys and sand accretion and dune evolution through LiDAR surveys using this very fancy equipment. And you can see in this photo, which was taken just a few months after the experiment was established, that some sand accretion is starting to occur even around these small grasses, a lot of which just looked like dead sticks when we planted them, but they lived, and now they're starting to accumulate more and more sand. Although there's only around a year of data collected for this experiment, the initial results we have show that the Ammophila species are accreting much more sand than the native plant plots. But however, we're still looking at patterns among the Ammophila species. So there's likely much more of the experiment to continue, and we're still looking at those data. In addition to sand accretion, I also mentioned that these plots are being monitored for vegetation growth and survival. So in February 2021, about 1,000 plants were implemented in each plot. And then a year later, we went back and counted how many remained, how many were still living. One of the most striking things we found is that the hybrid beachgrass plot survived, had much better survival than any of the other plots by a lot. So the hybrid had around a 90% survival rate, greater than both of its parents and their mixture. And this has pretty big implications for the hybrid spread and its persistence on dunes. All right, so now that I've talked about the hybrid's potential implications for dune shape, I'm going to move on and discuss how these hybrid built dunes in the future may protect against storms and sea level rise. These next few bullets of research are future directions, so we're still investigating them, and you'll stay tuned for results over time. It might be intuitive that taller and wider dunes protect better against storms and sea level rise or against flooding and erosion, but we can actually model this. And this research is done in collaboration with Dr. Peter Ruggiero's lab, which has developed this model to look at erosion and overwash using a suite of different factors. Into models like this, we can feed several different inputs, including dune height produced by different species. So for instance, after many years of the experiment, the Nehalem experiment operating, we can start to extract metrics such as dune height from these different experimental plots and feed them into the model. And we can also incorporate different climate scenarios as well. So we know that on a global scale, sea level rise is occurring and storms are increasing in frequency and intensity. In Oregon and Washington, these patterns are more variable on a smaller scale. So these models will be useful in addressing how the hybrid can affect coastal protection at different sites and different scenarios. And then similarly related to climate change, another ecosystem service that could be affected because of the hybrid is carbon sequestration, or how much carbon is sequestered and stored in the dunes. This research is being done by my lab mate, John Stepanek, for his PhD work. And dunes and beach grasses sequester carbon in different ways. So through their roots and shoots, or below ground and above ground biomass, as well as through the accumulation of sand as they form dunes. John can look at how each different beachgrass taxa stores carbon differently by taking sediment cores like those shown here and processing and analyzing them from their carbon content. So some of the sediment cores he's taken before are from the bag experiment that Sally talked about earlier, and he'll also do some coring at the Nehalem experiment as well. And so from these data or these samples, John will be able to analyze the differences in carbon content between dunes or between bags of the hybrid and its parents and start to see if there are any differences. And then lastly, I'll talk about how the hybrid could influence species diversity and conservation on coastal dunes. You may know already that one of the consequences of historic and current beachgrass invasions is less habitat for certain plant and animal species, including the western snowy plover, which is federally listed as threatened. It's also an extremely cute animal. It was recently described to me as a cotton ball on toothpicks. And since the hybrid is taller and in some cases denser than its parents and potentially survives better, it could have several big ecosystem changes for coastal dunes. And these changes could have negative effects for some native plants and plovers as well, continuing to decrease species diversity and challenge species conservation efforts on coastal dunes. Okay, so Sally and I have presented a lot of different directions and potential implications of the hybrid, and now I'll just tie it all together before moving on to the community science aspect part of this project. So in conclusion, we know about the hybrid's range and abundance now. We find it currently from Pacific City, Oregon to Ocean Shores, Washington, and we see that it's very abundant at Long Beach and Ocean Shores, Washington, especially. Then in terms of the hybrid's competitive ability and growth rate, we find that it's more productive than its parents and also able to outcompete Ammophila breviligulata, which is the most dominant beachgrass in its range. And finally, because of certain traits the hybrid displays, we hypothesize that it may be able to accrete more sand and build taller and wider dunes compared to its parents, which could provide greater coastal protection, greater carbon sequestration, but also decreased biodiversity compared to its parents. So again, like with its parents, the hybrid can pose these complex management trade-offs depending on different management priorities. We still have a lot of lingering questions about the hybrid, so our next steps are to continue investigating those potential impacts on ecosystem services, tie up those loose ends. We're also hoping to look for more hybrid beachgrass. As I mentioned, what we've detected is likely only a small portion of what's really out there. And then we want to continue to try to get the word out there to coastal community members, other organizations, managers, and planners about the hybrid and what it could mean for coastal dunes in the future. And now I'll expand a little bit more on how we're hoping to find more hybrid beachgrass, especially because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of areas that we haven't been able to search. I'm just one person and our lab group is just one group. There's only so many times we can go out to the dunes and search them. And there's certain areas such as just south of Fort Stevens, the entirety of Long Beach, Ocean Shores, and just north of it that we haven't searched super thoroughly or at all. And so it's easier with a lot more people. To expand the area and depth that we search, and also in an effort to connect community members to their ecosystem, Rebecca started the Citizen or Community Science Project in 2020 in partnership with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition and housed on the iNaturalist platform. And how it works is that anyone can post their observations of the hybrid and its parents on iNaturalist, and they'll be automatically channeled into this project. Rebecca worked closely over the last 2 years with Jesse Jones as well as Phil Johnson from Oregon Shores to get this program off the ground and continue to run it throughout the pandemic. Where I come in is that Rebecca is now graduating, wrapping up 6 years of her PhD work, and I'm jumping in and helping to continue the community science project through my master's work. If you've never used iNaturalist before too, I'll just give a brief description of how it works. It's this gigantic online community and database of plant and animal observations that anyone can add to, discuss, or verify other species identification. And each point, each observation is tied to an exact location. So it's really relevant to this hybrid mapping project because if someone spots the hybrid on the dunes, we can go back to that area or we know exactly where it was spotted. And this project has accomplished a ton over the last 2 years too. So there's about 1,000 observations and over 30 of the hybrid from nearly 600 different people. And we've actually discovered new hybrid patches because of this project too. So areas where we wouldn't have searched or we didn't search super thoroughly, we were able to find new hybrid because of community members posting their observations. On this project on iNaturalist, Rebecca also has some great resources that she's created over the years, such as this beachgrass ID guide for anyone to use to ID the species. It has the traits of the different beach grasses, their ranges. Also, you can use it in a mobile version, very intuitive to use. So since the best time to search for the hybrid is in July, in its peak flowering time, we're hosting several trainings to teach volunteers and community members how to look for and identify the hybrid and its parents on the dunes. These trainings will be at Sunset Beach in Fort Stevens on the North Coast. And this super cool unmanned aerial vehicle footage is from last year's training at Pacific City that Rebecca led. And once we learn how to ID the hybrid, we'll walk the dunes and try to find more of it. We chose the North Coast because it's an area that hasn't been super well searched by us. So it's likely that we'll discover new hybrid patches during this training too. I hope you can make it to one of these sessions. And if you're interested, please RSVP to Jessie at this email. All right, and now I have a bunch of acknowledgements, a lot of thank yous to make for everyone who helped with this research. Many funding sources, including the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Oregon State University, NOAA, Oregon Sea Grant, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and more. I also want to acknowledge that this research was conducted on the traditional homelands of the Quinault, Chehalis, Willapa, Chinook, Clatsop, Nehalem, Tillamook, Lower Chinook, Mistaka, and Kalapuya peoples. We owe a big debt of gratitude as we continue to research these beach grasses, one of the historic and ongoing effects of settlers in this region. Thank you also to all the field assistants who helped with this work over the years. This research wouldn't have been possible without them. And thanks to the folks I mentioned previously in this research, the major dune players that Sally introduced, as well as everyone from Oregon Shores. And then also thank you to the lab group I'm part of at Oregon State University. You may have seen us in a documentary that came out recently about our work on the dunes. It was super accurate. And thanks everyone for listening too. Sally and I would love to take any questions you all have.